I'm going to turn over the mic. I'm going to hand over the mic, as I say, to my mother-in-law. Again, as many of you know, she is a lecturer. She has written 2 books. She is an educator at the university at Binghamton as a Chabad Center for Jewish students at Binghamton University. And she travels the world. In fact, one of the points that David Sachs mentioned when he was on here was, we asked him a question. He said that you should go and find the video from his talk in South Africa. When I had called him up, he said he knows my mother-in-law well. They spoke in South Africa together. So again, she travels the world lecturing, and she is right here on Zoom with us. So thank you very much, Mrs. Slonim.
It's my pleasure, Rabbi Levertov.
Well, I can't call you by a first name, so.
True that. Hi, everyone. Hi, Levi. Hi, friends. I was listening to what Levi was saying a few minutes ago, and he was saying, my brother ordained, and then my other brother ordained, and he made it sound like condemned. I'm not ordained. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to be here with you. This, what is for you noon, and for what is for me afternoon. And we're going to talk a little bit about the place of Jewish women in Jewish law. And this session was actually spawned by our previous session about the TV miniseries Unorthodox, and the many questions that arose in people's minds when they watched that, and they wondered about the place of Jewish women in Jewish law. One of the things that's been very interesting for me is that I have long self-defined as a feminist, and I'm okay with people doing a double take when they hear the words Chassidic and feminist strung together. And they are very vociferous in saying it must be a mistake, it's impossible, it's mutually exclusive, it's oxymoronic. I take a little bit more umbrage when they try to tell me what I am and what I'm not. I feel like I have the same right as everyone else to define as I wish to define myself. To me, it's completely natural to define myself in these terms. And this is not the sum total of my definition, but I don't see it as mutually exclusive. And sometimes you find things in the most unlikely places that are of great interest. So interestingly, on page 76 of her book, Radical Feminism and Feminist Radicalism, Ellen Willis, a radical feminist, writes, and I quote, "The big lie of male supremacy is that women are less than fully human. The basic task of feminism is to expose that lie and fight it on every level. Yet for all my feminist militants, I was, it seemed, secretly afraid that the lie was true, that my humanity was hopelessly at odds with my ineluctable female sexuality. While the Rebbitzin," it seems that she's describing a conversation she had with the Rebbitzin, "staunch apostle of traditional femininity, did not appear to doubt for a moment that she could be both a woman and a serious person, which was only superficially paradoxical, for if you are absolutely convinced that the Jewish woman's role was ordained by God," there's that word again, "and that it was every bit as important spiritually as the man's, how could you believe the lie?" How indeed. Now, don't get me wrong, I might be a staunch apostle of tradition. That doesn't mean that I don't detect strains of sexism, chauvinism in Orthodox life, in Hasidic life, and I might add all around me. It's really pretty ubiquitous. And I believe that we need to agitate and exercise until the changes that must be made are made. But interestingly enough, I think the general charges brought against traditional Judaism are completely unfounded. If we had a little bit more time, I would tell you a little bit more about my own personal journey in this regard and my own trajectory. But I'd like to go straight to talking to issues, specifically the issues that you're most interested in talking about. And so I just want to do one thing kind of as an introduction here. Maybe you're familiar with the story, but if there's even one person who's part of this meeting who has not heard the story, then it's worth all of you hearing it yet again. When Henry Kissinger became the Secretary of State in the US, this was a very, very big deal. This was before anybody could conceive of a vice presidential candidate who kept Shabbat, who was Shomer Shabbat, who was actually introduced at the Democratic National Convention that year by Al Gore, who introduced himself as Joe Lieberman's Shabbos Goy, if you could believe that, but it's true. You could go back and listen to it. So it was very long before this happened, and it was a very big deal that a Jew had become part of the inner cabinet. And Golda Meir, who was then the prime minister in the state of Israel, sent Henry Kissinger a note, actually it was a telegram of congratulations. And when she read it, she detected what she felt might be a little bit of him, might be a little bit of her currying favor for the then very nascent state of Israel. And it made Henry Kissinger nervous. So he wrote back to her, "Thank you, Prime Minister, Madame Prime Minister, for your congratulations. But let me please remind you, I am first an American, second a diplomat, and third a Jew." To which she quickly fired back, "Delighted to receive your communique. As you know, in Israel, we read from right to left." And that's a really, besides being a funny story, true, and I collect true vignettes about Golda Meir. I think she was absolutely brilliant and witty and everything else. Big fan here. But aside from that, I bring that story to your attention because I really do believe that context is everything, and that if we're going to have a discussion about Jewish women and Jewish law, we need to, as it were, read from right to left. We need to understand what we're looking at. You know, this is the first rule of anthropology. It's a little bit like going to a country and not understanding how your currency works against the currency of the country you're visiting. It could be extremely confusing to make purchases. I remember coming to Italy when I was a young child. I was 12, and I remember all of a sudden everything cost everything cost millions. It was just an adjustment in my mind in terms of how the currency worked there. And it's the same thing with ideas, just really on steroids. So it's really not helpful. In fact, it's always not fruitful to superimpose one set of values on another. If you want to really understand a system, you have to go to the crux, you have to go to the vortex, you have to go to the values. So that's what I really want to do here. I want to set out some of the basic values, the principles, and then I'll take all of your questions. But I think that this could be helpful and a much more fruitful way to look at a subject that I think people have very, very strong opinions about, and for good reason. And I have noticed that in any of these discussions, unless we kind of set the backdrop and put out certain values, it's going to be like one of those carnival games. You know, you throw down one and then the other one pops up. There's always going to be an issue that's going to be irksome or bothersome or completely impenetrable unless we speak to the core values. So I'm going to begin now. I want to say a word about Jewish identity. I think that modernity posits the self as an autonomous being with endless options, choices, possibilities, iterations, no single imperative. Judaism actually posits our Jewish identity as inviolable. You can't cancel it. You could try, but you just can't cancel it. So you could stand on your head, you could spit rusty nickels, you could convert to Catholicism, you could convert to Islam, you can become the prime minister or the head of state of the atheists and agnostics continent, and you still won't be any less Jewish. And this, I think, will be important to our understanding of this discussion. So you could call yourself anything, but from the perspective of Judaism, it doesn't change your inviolable self, the most essential aspect of the self. So that's just one thing I want to throw into the mix. The next thing I want to do is talk about the centrality of the oral tradition. Because one of the big things that invariably comes up when we talk about Jewish women and Jewish law is, well, Who made these laws up anyway? A bunch of rabbis, obviously. So they're coming from the patriarchal, phallocentric perspective, and now they want to boss us around and tell us what to do. So I just want to take a moment to address this, and I want to say this. Maybe you know the joke about the guy who says to God, you know, you made man out of the earth, I can make man out of the earth as well. So God says, okay, great, go ahead. He says, okay, I'm going to start with the earth here. He says, so God says, no. You have to first create the earth if you want to create man. Can't use my earth. So that joke kind of reminds me of this idea where there's been more than one writing that speaks to this idea of we're going to stand again at Sinai. We're going to recreate a feminist Judaism, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But what are you going to create it out of? In other words, if you're going to reject the entire rabbinic tradition, what's your Judaism going to look like? It certainly can't include Hanukkah, because that's rabbinic. It can't include Purim. The injunction to fast on Yom Kippur is not spelled out in the written tradition per se. And I could go on and on. You basically would deconstruct the Judaism that we have. And then the question is, well, what do you keep? And so really it becomes a situation of a Chinese menu. Well, we like this, we'll keep this, but we don't like this, we won't keep this, and so on and so forth. From the perspective of tradition, a tremendous amount of the oral tradition was received by Moses at Sinai and then passed down orally for many generations. But it wasn't made up by the rabbis. The rabbis were scribes who retained a certain tradition. Now, not everything in the oral tradition is in this category, but a lot is. For instance, if you've ever seen phylacteries tefillin, I guarantee you, you'll never see pink tefillin or hunter green tefillin or purple tefillin. You'll only see black tefillin, and you'll only see square tefillin. These are things that were passed down from the time of Moses, etc., down through the ages. Now, there are aspects of the rabbinic tradition that were expounded from the written law, and then there are edicts as well. But in general, in the aggregate, it's impossible to understand anything in the written Torah, anything in the 5 books of Moses, without usage of the oral tradition. So this wholesale accusation that the rabbis are out to get us, or they don't understand us, or they are hopelessly out of step with the modern age, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you're going to adopt that, then, you know, let's be consistent. And what is that going to look like? But to say, well, this works, that doesn't work, that becomes a different thing. Another thing I think is important to talk about is the notion of Jewish law, halacha, what it is and what it isn't. So first, it's important to understand that Jewish law, for those who take it seriously, is not a series of suggestions or aphorisms that might be interesting to look at and see if they resonate. It's law. It's meant to be taken seriously. Just as one's Jewish identity is meant to be taken seriously. One's Jewish identity really defines not only who we are, but what we are, why we are. So Jewish law is not very much about feeling. It's about performing. Or said differently, and I think this is really important, the emphasis is not on finding meaning. The emphasis is on finding purpose. And let me explain for a moment, with your permission, the difference between that. If it's about finding meaning, then everybody finds meaning as something else. So if somebody tells me that the meaning of their life is to collect beer cans from the 1960s, who am I to comment on that? That's their prerogative, right? Which means that there's no way really to measure the authenticity of meaning. It means something else for everyone else, for each person. But if you talk about purpose, which is what Jewish tradition is all about, then the subtext here, the message is, your presence in this world has specific purpose. It's God saying, I need you, because together we have a project to do. And so the emphasis is not on the performer, the emphasis is on the commander. And I think as postmodern Westerns, we have a hard time with anything that doesn't put us at the center. Because, we're used to, we live in a society where it's all about the consumer. I'm at the center, and that's why there are people sitting in laboratories creating more breakfast cereals and more types of crackers and more products to soothe my ego and massage my likings and what I'm inclined to do. And the Torah comes along and says, you are extremely important, but the emphasis is on your creator, and you're entering into a partnership with that creator. So in like fashion, I'll just emphasize this point by nitpicking on a certain word. Words are kind of like toys for me. I actually love words and enjoy the way they're used and learning stories and history behind the usage of words. So the word spirituality, I want to opine, is roundly misunderstood. The word spirituality actually talks to an experience that is beyond the physical senses. But a lot of people, I find, conflate spirituality with godliness. That is to say that if it makes them feel good, if it makes them feel warm and fuzzy, if it makes them feel connected, if it resonates, if they start to levitate, if they feel aligned and calibrated, then it must be holy, it must be good. But in actuality, spirituality, like I said, just means something that you're experiencing that cannot be defined through the five senses. So looking at the sun setting or rising can be spiritual. Listening to a moving concerto. People ask me all the time why they feel so moved when they walk into St. Patrick's Cathedral, but they don't feel that way when they go into the synagogue. And I'm like, maybe it's the architecture. You could feel very spiritual by taking a real good hit on a powerful drug. But these don't translate into godly experiences. And I think we really need to kind of distinguish. So not everything that God wants us to do, male or female, is always going to feel so good or so comfortable. I do it, well, before this virus, I did a fair amount of travel. I'd find myself in airports, and these days, there what seem to be some pretty high-end restaurants in these airports. But being kosher, what can I eat? Chips, granola bars, fruit, yogurt. I've run out of options, right? So what am I feeling when I'm hungry? Spiritual? I'm calibrated? I'm in sync? No, I am hungry, cranky, I have a headache. My husband gets a lot of points for putting up with me when I call him and complain. But that is godly. May not feel spiritual, but I'm acting on what God wants of me. Another thing I want to throw out there is that unlike in the Western world, where much is the barometer is about achievement, power, and access, in Judaism, it's really all about our covenant with God. And so Judaism is not patriarchal, it's not matriarchal, it's covenantal. It's really actually about losing yourself in something larger. And finally, and this will be my last point before we go into some of the actual issues, I think a really hard thing for us, when I say us, I mean us living in this time in history with the kind of the way we think, is that we were raised on a steady diet of our inalienable rights. And my rights end where your nose begins. But from the perspective of Judaism, it's really all about obligation. Obligation is the point of departure. Obligation is the point of return. And when you live within that framework, it's going to look very different than living in a framework of, well, what are my rights? These are my rights. You can't take away my rights from me, and so on and so forth. So from the perspective of everything I've said, women's obligation and women's privilege to have a meaningful relationship with God is 1,002% on a par with the male obligation and privilege of having a relationship with God. However, if you were to observe a Orthodox or traditional community, certainly from the outside, you would be correct in assuming that there's very grave differences in that relationship between a man and God and a woman and God. So I'm actually going to do something a little intrepid here and ask Rabbi Levi Levertov, to the one who's ordained, to unmute everybody. And I'd like to take your guesses on how the amount of mitzvot that impact women as opposed to men, the difference, and how many mitzvot you think it is that a woman can't do that a man can do in traditional Judaism. If you'll unmute us,
All right,
Rabbi,
everyone is unmuted. You're gonna get a lot of feedback.
oh, that's true. Okay, do people want to just type their guesses in the chat then? You're right, bad idea.
All right, so if you would like to shout out an answer, then unmute yourself maybe and then remute yourself. That would work.
Or put it in the chat. I'm going to take guesses for 3 minutes. It's like 615. 613. Okay, that's the total number of commandments in the Torah, but how many do you think a woman can do of those? Or how many can't she do?
I think she could do them all. maybe not sexual, loses seed or whatever, but
okay, well, let me make this a little bit more fair for everyone, okay? There are a few hundred mitzvot that neither men nor women can perform in this present day because we no longer sadly have the temple, we don't live in the land of Israel, and so on and so forth. Okay, so from the remaining few hundred that we can perform, I'm looking for your guess on how many it is a woman can perform or how many it is that you think a woman cannot. Alan is saying 1. I don't know if he means women can only do 1 mitzvah or if he means that there's only 1 they can't do. Levi Levertov is making it clear to everybody what the question is. Murray's saying there's about 100 that women are not allowed to perform. Thanks, Murray. Anybody else?
I would say at least 100, it seems. I know that a woman's not allowed to chant Torah.
Okay.
I don't think that's fair, but that's what it is.
Okay, all right.
Women aren't allowed to sit next to men at funerals, at Orthodox funerals.
Since when is women sitting next to men a mitzvah?
No, it's not a mitzvah. Well, okay.
We're going to, I'm just ripping you. We're going to talk about
separation of men and women at Orthodox funerals.
Okay, we're going to talk about that. Somebody's saying most of the positive commandments cannot be performed by women. So let me just explain. This is a very important aspect, actually. The Torah is comprised of many mitzvot, as we said, 613, and they can be divided in different categories. And amongst the most basic categories is those that are positive and those that are negative. In other words, the positive injunctions, thou shalt, and the prohibitions, thou shalt not. Okay, so before I move on, I'm just looking for any more guesses, but we're going to move on.
I think that women can pretty much do all the mitzvot, except that they are not obligated to do them.
Okay.
There are many mitzvot that they can do, but they are not obligated. And of course, it's done in different ways in different religious denominations.
Okay, great. Anything else? Any other input? You like my glasses? Thank you, Myra. Women cannot do circumcision. I'm learning. Okay, good. I'm going to ask Rabbi Levi, 400 mitzvot that women can't do. All right, let's put the list on share the document, please. Thank you. Okay, so before we go any further, here's the sum total of mitzvot that women are exempt from. That is different than what they are prohibited from doing, okay? Women are exempt from the following mitzvot. I will first go through them, and then we'll talk more about this. Women are exempt from reciting the Shema daily. This is a separate mitzvah from daily prayer. And I might add that biblically speaking, men and women have equal obligation to pray every day, and we'll talk more about that. This is a separate mitzvah. Women are exempt from this mitzvah. They're exempt from putting on tefillin, phylacteries, both the tefillin on the head, which is called shel rosh, and tefillin shel yad, the tefillin that goes on the hand. Women are exempt from wearing tzitzit, exempt from counting the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, called counting the Omer, exempt from hearing the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, sitting in the sukkah, and taking the 4 types of vegetation on the holiday of Sukkot. They are exempt from circumcision, from the mitzvah, the commandment that we refer to as Shana Rishona, which means that a man has a more pronounced obligation to make his wife happy during the first year of marriage, to spend more time with her, to just give her extra attention during that time. Women are exempt from marriage. Yes, marriage is not a lifestyle choice. It is actually a mitzvah, but is a mitzvah upon a man, which means that if a man decides not to get married, if he doesn't have a particular reason, he just makes a decision that he's not going to get married, then that is an infraction. Whereas if a woman decided not to get married, she's not trespassing a law. Now, if she gets married, she takes part in the mitzvah, but it's not her mitzvah. And the same thing is true, as counterintuitive as it sounds, about procreation. Again, if a woman decides not to have children, that's her prerogative. But if a man, again, given all things being equal, decides not to have children, that is a trespass. Learning and teaching Torah is something a woman is exempt from. She's exempt from writing a Torah, and she's exempt from giving the priestly blessing. Okay. Now, of these 14 that we have delineated here, there are actually very few that observant women don't take part in. Observant women will be saying Shema twice daily, counting the Omer, hearing the shofar being blown, sit in the sukkah, take the 4 kinds. Many, if not most, will get married and have children if God blesses them with that. Will learn and teach Torah. Will probably buy a share in a new Torah that's being written. So as you can see, when you look at the list, there's actually very, very few differences, which only begs the question of why does there seem to be such a pronounced delineation in the roles in traditional Judaism between men and women. So thank you, Rabbi, for sharing that screen. And now I think it's okay if you take it off. Thank you. So I'd like to offer 3 kind of axiomatic ideas that I believe the role differences are connected to. And then we will move further with your questions, and we'll just go along with what you are interested in exploring, because we're not going to be able to cover it all in this session. This I guarantee you. So the first of the important ideas is the primacy of the Jewish home. And this is a really interesting time to be talking about this, because as you know, all the shuls, all the synagogues have been shut down. Almost the totality of Jewish infrastructure, wherever you look, schools, camps, federations, JCCs, all shut down, shut down, shut down. And I think that this is underscoring and pointing our direction to a truth that has been lost on so many for way too long. And that is that Judaism is not a synagogue-based religion. It's not a church-based religion. It's not a mosque-based religion. It's not an ashram-based religion. And it is not a synagogue-based religion. It's a home-based religion, which is why observant people are not observing any less now than when they go to synagogue. I want to repeat that. I'll say it differently. Take an observant man. Take an Orthodox observant man. Take an ultra-Orthodox observant man. Take a Chassidic man who goes to the synagogue 3 times a day and goes back twice more to study. Still, over 90% of his observance will be happening in the home. And here's the thing that Judaism has always maintained. This has nothing to do with feminism. This is not apologetics. It's right there in ancient Jewish writings. The Jewish woman has always been the mainstay, the mistress, the priestess, the anchor, call it what you will, the defining feature and the defining influence of the Jewish home. Now, here's the thing. You can't have a religion that says the home is the most important institution and then not have someone who's in charge of bolstering this most important institution. Do you see what I'm saying? I always tell my students that it's easy for people to kind of take certain ideas and present them as definitively Jewish, like rebuilding New Orleans or saving Wales or whatever. Now, these are all very important endeavors. But when you tell me that this is the crux of Judaism, my first question to you is going to be, every value in Judaism is tethered to law and is bolstered by a system of law. Because if it's ideas, then they remain ethereal. Everybody, talk is cheap, but can you walk the walk? So in Judaism, if something is important, there are going to be laws that tease out just how you will take this great value and make it practical. So if saving whales, for instance, is a great mitzvah, how many whales do I have to save in order to perform the mitzvah? Do they have to be male or female? How long does it, and what time do I have to save these whales? Where do I put these whales after I've saved them? There should be many, many laws that govern this, okay? So if we're saying that the Jewish home is the single most important institution, well, who's minding the home, as it were? Now, this is a very, very, let's just say, sensitive subject. I remember when parenting was a new term. Yeah, I'm that old. It used to be mothering, then it became parenting, which make it sound like all the children are getting double a dose of people taking care of them. But parenting is really a term for, well, I don't want to do this alone, or I don't want to do this alone. Okay, we're both going to do this. And I have to say that this is a very sensitive subject for me, because I was never a stay-at-home mom. And part of what I do, or did before this very current state, is travel. And some of my speaking is on the subject of Jewish women and Jewish law. And I show up and I'm talking about how important it is for Jewish women to be at home, but I'm 5,000 miles away from home. And I could just read the question mark in the head. And I joke and say, well, maybe it's a case of those who can't teach, maybe it's been determined that it's healthier for my children that they ship me out of my home. But I bring this up not just to kibitz with you, but the truth of the matter here is that a lot of people conflate, the mother being the mainstay of the home, or the woman being the mainstay of the home, and housekeeping. I am not talking about housekeeping. You can outsource that. You can outsource cooking, laundry, and all of that. I'm talking about the defining and definitive influence of the home. And that has always been the privilege and obligation of Jewish women, which is why Jewish women in Jewish law are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot, commandments that must be performed within a certain time frame. Now, immediately, I should be feeling some pushback from you, which is hard to feel over the screen. But what you should be thinking here is, wait, let's look at those 14 mitzvot. A bunch of those are time-bound, right? So let's talk about this a little bit more. First of all, any commandment that has both a positive and negative component, men and women have equal obligation. So anything to do with Shabbat, anything to do with any mitzvah that has both a negative and positive, which is many, equal obligation. Okay. Then there are a whole bunch of obligations that are incumbent upon women, even though they're time bound, like the mitzvot of Hanukkah and the mitzvot having to do with Purim. And that is because Jewish women were very, very high profile in bringing about those miraculous results. And therefore they take upon, we're obligated to do those mitzvot. Now, if I were to go through this with you, if we were having a seminar of 3 hours rather than what's supposed to be a talk for less than an hour, then I would show you, but now you'll just have to believe me, that there are more exceptions to this rule than there are mitzvot that fall under this rule, which means there has to be more than just this reason of the woman being exempt from this so she could pay attention to what is her overarching obligation and privilege. Okay, but before we move on to the other reasons, I want to point out one thing, and that is people often ask, is an observant Jewish woman allowed to work outside the home? And the answer to that is a categoric yes. And I think at this point, everybody knows this. It's not such a well-kept secret. You want to be a vice president, you want to be a neurosurgeon, you want to be a clown, you want to be an Indian chief, you want to be a shoemaker, you can do whatever you want outside the home, okay? Well, why? Why can you do that? Shouldn't you have to be in the home, tied to the vat of chicken soup, behind the curtain, in the kitchen, pregnant and barefoot? How do they let them out of the house? Okay, but here's the truth, okay? Mitzvot, as I said earlier, are not suggestions, they're obligations. What a woman or a man, for that matter, chooses to do outside the home is a prerogative. It's your choice. It's not an obligation. So if a woman makes a choice that she wants to have a home and work outside the home, and she wants to have a very demanding career, fantastic. If she has the the right support, if she has the right level of dedication, more power to her. I remember once years ago listening to a presentation by a woman who I remember she said she had 5 or 6 children while going through medical school. She eventually became, I think, an adolescent psychiatrist. So if you do the math, that's a lot of years of school. It's one fellowship upon another. And when people asked her, well, how do you do it? Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, her husband was going through medical school at the same time. Okay. So people said, well, how did you do this? How did you do this? And she dropped her voice. I'll never forget this. And everybody kind of moved closer to the edge of their seat. And very quietly, she said, cornflakes. I whispered cornflakes, just like she did. And her point was this: I am sure they didn't just eat cornflakes for 12 years. I'm sure they also had Rice Krispies and Chex. But the point was that she was ready, they were both ready to sacrifice for what they wanted to do. Okay, but you could do that because it's not an imperative, it's a choice you made. Whereas mitzvot are obligations. You simply can't obligate one person in 2 directions at the same time. Just not possible. Having said that, let's move on to what I think are another 2 aspects that play into this. And then we're going to open up for discussion, and you're going to tell me what you think is the most pressing area for us to explore, and we'll do that for as long as we have. I think another aspect of this is modesty. Now, modesty is a really hard thing to talk about today because I don't think we, as a culture, even have a frame of reference for modesty today. It's like, what's modest? Try walking into a store before COVID and saying you're looking for a modest outfit. If you do find somebody who's going to help you, and that doesn't happen very often today, but let's say you walked into somewhere higher end and somebody comes over to help you and you say you're looking for a modest outfit, they might wrinkle their forehead and say, do you mean modestly priced? Like, what is modesty? I'll never forget moving to Binghamton just a little bit over 35 years ago, and I lived in a apartment complex. And my oldest child at the time was a toddler, and I lived in the basement apartment. And between my apartment and the apartment of my closest neighbor was the laundry room. So when you have a toddler, you're doing laundry with some frequency. She also had a young child, and so Brenda and I became, friendly, as only mothers of children of similar ages can do, over doing laundry together. And maybe I knew her for about a month when one morning she said to me, Rivka, she used to call me Rivka. What do you think about, and then she said her husband's name, having a vasectomy. And I remember thinking, wow, I was lucky I understood what she was saying altogether. I probably had just, come across the term vasectomy maybe, I don't know, not that long before that point in my life. And now she's asking me what I think. And when I finally found my tongue, I said to her, it sounds a little radical to me. You guys are young. Maybe maybe you want to try something that's a little more reversible. And then when we finished that conversation, I went into my house. And I could remember like today, sitting down on my couch and trying to unpack what just happened here. Why did this woman ask me this question? Why is that my business? And I realized then and there with a start that the only thing that was private was your salary. It is extremely uncouth to ask someone about their finances. But everything else was apparently up for grabs. But in Judaism, modesty has always been, continues to be, and will always be a very important value. And there is something about the female role that is more inner and more modest than the male role that is more kind of jutting outward and external. And I think that that has something to do with the difference in roles. And finally, women are spiritually different. Now, can you tell I've been living on a campus for a long time, and it was actually hard for me to say that to you because I figured there might be X coming through the screen at me to assert this blasphemy that males and females are different in any way. I recognize this is a great sin. Forgive me, God. But Judaism certainly takes this as a value, takes this as a fact, and is attentive to this. And let me give you an example. So very early on in our discussion, somebody said that women are excused from or may not engage in circumcision. Now, this is a very interesting question, actually, to look at, because if circumcision is absolutely central to Judaism, which we believe it is, and if it is about the bond between the Jew and God, the indelible sign of that bond, then really we would have to ask, why did God not create the female body with a limb to be circumcised? In other words, saying that women are exempt from circumcision because they don't have penises is circular reasoning, right? If we're saying it's God's earth, as it were, right? God created everything from scratch. So what's the problem? So it's really fascinating to look into the Talmud, which was written over 2,000 years ago, when feminism wasn't a glint in anybody's eye yet. And the Talmud simply says, women are born circumcised. Okay, now what does that mean? Okay, if you look into the Torah, if you look into the Bible, and you look for the word for one who is not circumcised, it's orel, the Hebrew word ayin resh lamed. Okay. And interestingly enough, in Deuteronomy, it talks about God circumcising your heart, taking off that orel, that impediment on your heart. Okay. It becomes clear that spiritually circumcision is about opening up a blockage. Okay, the physical procedure of circumcision is just that. It's the material facade of a spiritual procedure, and that is the opening up of a pathway between man and God. And the Talmud says a woman is born circumcised. So what are you going to do? Circumcise the one who is already circumcised? Now, this is a very important principle because there seems to be this definitive idea that anything a man does is ipso facto better than what a woman is permitted to do. I have never heard men gripe about the fact that they can't put a doily on their hair and light Shabbat candles, or that they can't go to the mikveh on a monthly basis. More to the point, why do we have so many American families giving their daughters a bat mitzvah at 13 when the Mishnah says a girl becomes a woman at the age of 12, a full year before the male, because she arrives at a maturity a full year before? Hey, that can't be true, because if a boy has a bar mitzvah at 13, that must be better. Okay. So one thing Judaism is not into is redundancy. So if somebody is circumcised, you can't circumcise the circumcised. I'll give you another example. Tefillin, phylacteries, which I've mentioned already twice before. So this is a very important thing for a Jewish male over the age of 13 to do every day, with the exception of Shabbat and Jewish holidays. In fact, putting tefillin on Shabbat or holidays is a trespass of Jewish law. Well, why? If I like to put on tefillin, why should I be able to put on tefillin any day I want? It'll make me feel closer to God. Shabbat is the day of closest to God. I should be able to put on tefillin. Maybe I should be able to put on tefillin 5 times on Shabbat. On a pedestrian Tuesday once, but on Shabbat at least 3 times, right? Actually wrong. So it turns out that according to Jewish law, a man needs to have 2 signs of his covenant with God upon him all the time. So one is, of course, circumcision, and the other is tefillin. And in generations gone by, Jewish men actually used to wear tefillin all day. But we can maybe speak to that again. If you're interested in speaking about women and tefillin, we'll mention that again. But that was what happened until Jewish men really recognized that they were unable to sustain the kind of mental focus and physical cleanliness necessary to wear tefillin all day, okay? But Shabbat is one of those things in the Torah that is called a sign between man and God, okay? One of those is circumcision, one of those is tefillin, and one of those is Shabbat. So on Shabbat, you already have 2 signs. Therefore, tefillin becomes redundant and therefore not permissible. My point here is, and this ties together a whole bunch of points I actually made, okay? That is, mitzvot are not playthings, you know? They're not things we do to massage our egos or up our moods or make us feel important or connected or fuzzy-wuzzy. They're important commandments. They serve a very important purpose in our lives and in the entire cosmic balance. And when we understand that, we're looking at it from a completely different perspective. So I have really ran on for way, way too long, and I apologize. And I want to take your questions or comments. I'll just close with one thing that I think is important for all of us to remember. And here I'm quoting from an address by Menachem Alon. Menachem Alon was Israel's Supreme Court Justice. He was quite well known. And in a 1990 address, he said, "As far as equality is concerned, I would like to point out that there is a major principle in law which distinguishes discrimination, which is invalid, from distinction, which is valid, such that one must treat every person equally unless there are differences between them which are real and relevant to the issue." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm really happy to take your questions, comments, anything at all, really.
Thank you. I already see a question in the chat. So anyone who has a question, please, if you have the ability to put it into the chat, will be best. But if not, definitely unmute your mic, share your question, and then you can mute it so we don't get the feedback.
Okay, Marilyn is asking, what are the responsibilities in Jewish life if a woman chooses not to get married, or in later life if her children are out of the home? Okay, so let me state the obvious. We already saw how few mitzvot a woman is exempt from. So every Jewish woman has hundreds of mitzvot that she can perform, and so many important ways in which she can join God in partnership with every other person who wants to join in this covenant and partnership in making this world a godly place. There is no dearth of opportunity, no dearth of obligation, no dearth of ways in which she can express and give this world her gifts. If a woman is exempt from mitzvah, does that mean she is not allowed to do this? Okay, that's a very important question. So let's go through that list again. Rabbi Levi, can you share it?
Yeah, coming right up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, a woman can recite the Shema daily, of course. She can count the Omer. I'm aware that I skipped 2A, 2B, and 3. I'll come back. Count the Omer. Ah, thank you, Levi. You see why he was ordained? Hear the blowing of the shofar. Sit in the sukkah. Take the 4 kinds. Marry. Procreate. Learn and teach Torah. And write and take part in writing a Torah. Most Jews don't write a Torah themselves. They are part of the project of a Torah being written. Okay, so circumcision, that's easy one to knock off. We've spoken about that. Okay, certainly a woman should take extra care with nourishing and nurturing her marriage. But because she doesn't have the mitzvah to get married, which is why the man marries the woman, it's his mitzvah to give her the ketubah, the marriage contract, etc., etc., and it's his mitzvah to nourish that nascent marriage in that first year. And I might add, and I always found this very beautiful and very poignant, that in biblical law, there's such a thing as a milchemet mitzvah, a war that necessitates everybody between the ages of 20 and 60 being called up, basically drafted. But there are a few exceptions. And one of those is a man who's in his first year of marriage. In other words, as real as dangers might be, the Jewish people have always understood that the most important thing they have to nourish and nurture is the institution of marriage, the home, the bedrock of our people. Okay, so what are we left with? Jewish women who were the daughters of Kohanim did not give the priestly blessing in the temple. And then moving up, we have tzitzit. Now, a woman is exempt from wearing tzitzit, and there is no actual prohibition in her wearing tzitzit, okay? If she wants to wear tzitzit, Jewish law does, however, state that it is best that she do so in a way where nobody else can see she's wearing the tzitzit. And let me explain why, okay? Now, when we talk about tzitzit, or otherwise it's called the talit katan, the small talit, okay? So if you look at that commandment, it's actually contingent on wearing a certain type of garment that has 4 corners. Now, certainly today, most people don't wear a 4-cornered garment. But even in yesteryear, many people might not wear a 4-corner garment. But because the mitzvah of tzitzit is so important, as a reminder of all the other mitzvot, it's actually mentioned in the Shema. So Jewish men went out of their way to create 4-cornered garment and put the tzitzit there. The reason I'm pointing this out is because it's already a contingent mitzvah. Then it's a time-bound mitzvah. You can only make the blessing over the tzitzit during the day. So this mitzvah is actually twice removed from a woman. And so there was kind of this concern that in doing this mitzvah that is kind of twice removed from her, why would she be doing this? Might she be doing this to kind of bring attention to her overwhelming piety or something like this? So if she wears the tzitzit under her clothing, there's absolutely no halachic concern. So what we're left with really is the tefillin. And this brings us back to something I mentioned earlier, that in generations, bygone era, men actually used to wear tefillin all day. And then it became really impossible for them to sustain the criteria for wearing tefillin. And so now men wear tefillin while they are praying their morning service. It's a very short, relatively short amount of time of the whole day, somewhere between 30 minutes and 60 minutes, let's say, and that's sustainable, that's doable, okay? But there is always the inherent danger that even in that short amount of time, the thought process might not be focused. The body might not be 100% clean. And therefore, Reb Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, the foremost codifier for Ashkenazic Jewry, ruled that a woman should not wear tefillin because she doesn't have the obligation, but there is an inherent danger in wearing them if you can't wear them properly, and therefore she should not wear them. So that's kind of, there are other things in Jewish law where we learn we're not allowed to put ourselves in a dangerous situation, whether physical or spiritual. So the man, as it were, must take the chance. A woman doesn't have the obligation and therefore should not take the chance. That's the legalistic level. On the spiritual level, on the more spiritual level, the more mystical level, again, it's something the woman doesn't need, just like the man doesn't need the tefillin on Shabbos. It's something that the woman's soul doesn't need. So that, I think, answers your question. If you take us off share, I can see the chat. I think I've lost the chat. Well, look at this. Thank you. Thanks, Levi. Do women have to get permission to go for higher education? No. In a community where anybody has to get permission to go for higher education, it would be the males as well as the females. And for males, it would be much more difficult to get that permission if permission had to be obtained. I'm a university professor, learned a long time ago that males and females differ. I had to work with my students to understand differ does not mean lesser. Yes, thank you. That's why I shared Menachem Malone's comment, the distinction between distinction and discrimination. Anybody else? Yes.
Am I allowed to give a public hello to Rivky or no?
Hey, Avi, you already did. That's the way to do it. That's the Jewish way. First you do it, then you ask.
There you go. That's the Jewish way. I just want to say it's good to see everybody again. And I am a former student of Rivky's. And as a comedian, every time I do shows for Chabad, I just want to say whenever they're concerned about it being appropriate or clean, I went to Binghamton with the Slonims and they all go, oh, okay, that's it. And they all like, that's enough street cred that I learned anything from Rivky Slonim is enough. So it's great to see you again. So
Avi is one of my all-time favorites and is always looking to massage my ego.
he has to say that.
Great to see you. Really great to see you, Avi. You know I love you.
Hi, Rivky.
Yes.
My name is Hannah Lang, and I really enjoyed your talk. It's
Hi,
wonderful.
Hannah.
And I have a couple of questions.
Bring them up.
One of them is centered on the Rebbetzin from Nepal that was not allowed to light the torch for Yom HaAtzmaut because the council turned her down. Can you answer that question for me? What would be, why? And that's a definite, I'm sure that if it was her husband that was picked, there wouldn't be a question. And the second thing is about the idea of covering that an Orthodox Hasidic woman needs to cover her hair. And I'm looking at your hair and I'm not sure that it looks like you are covering your hair, and it's beautiful. But it seems to be sort of ambiguous to me. And why does it need to be? Because some of the shadels that are being worn in many cases are more beautiful than some of the natural hair, which defeats the purpose if one is to be humble or not show the hair in case it makes the male, become aroused.
Okay. Hannah, thank you so much for your questions. Both excellent questions, which I'll be happy to respond to. But I'll just state that your comment that you're sure that if it would have been her husband, he would have been permitted to light the torch, reminds me about a story from the city of Chelm. Now, the city of Chelm in Poland actually was inhabited by a great many very, very, very smart people. And they feared that they might suffer an evil eye because they had such a propensity for intellectual acumen. So they propagated this myth that they were all very silly. And so there's all these stories about the city of Chelm. So there's this story about a guy from Chelm, and he has this big city. So Chelm is a small city, and he has this big city person come visit his farm. And he's very proud, and he shows this very urbane, very sophisticated guy from the city his farm. And he sees that the guy's not very impressed, but okay, he shows him around, he's proud. And then he shows him his vehicle, some kind of tractor. And the tractor's kind of sputtering along. It doesn't go very quickly. And wait, I think I'm mangling the story. Okay, so he shows it. Wait, Avi, you know the story? You want to help me? Did I see you lean in? Okay.
Yeah, I thought I'm off today. I'm not sure whether.
Okay, okay, I know what it is. He's showing him the farm, and then the guy from big city sees a tractor, and so the guy in Chelm is looking for a little bit more of, for this big city guy to be impressed. He says, "What? You don't think I have a big farm?" Meanwhile, this guy from has a much larger property, and so he tries to explain just how large his property is. So he says to this guy, "Well, let's put it this way. If you went in your tractor, it would take you a few days to get from one end of my property to the other." So the guy looked back at him. He said, "Oh yeah, I used to have a tractor like that too." Meaning, to him, he was really convinced that he had the largest piece of property. He couldn't conceive of a larger property than he had. So it must be, when this guy said it would take a few days to get through his property with the vehicle, it must be that there was something wrong with the vehicle. Okay. And so I think, Chana, that you share a certain perception with a lot of people. Like I said earlier, that it's just really this terrible plot against women. But if it was her husband, of course, he would be permitted to do so. So let me just say that it's actually the converse. And I don't even think her husband would have dreamt of doing it or even brought the question to the council. The question you raise is important, and that's why I don't want to skirt it, but it actually has nothing to do with our larger discussion. And the answer is as follows. And this is a complicated, delicate discussion, and I'm going to try to do what I can in a few minutes, okay? And what I'm going to do is simply draw a distinction between the land of Israel and the state of Israel, okay? The state of Israel, or what some might call the Zionist enterprise, was founded in actuality by people who hoped to begin a new era for Jews, which would have very little, if anything, to do with Jewish tradition, with Torah, with mitzvot. That was all supposed to be from the old world. And now it was going to be a new world, and the Jew is going to be normal like everyone else, which is why, in fact, if you look historically, there were other parts of the world that were offered for the Jewish homeland. And it really was not a problem on theological terms for the Zionist fathers to accept that. So we could have had the state of Israel in Uganda. But the land of Israel will always be exactly where it is. It is the heart and soul of us as a people. And for millennia, we have been praying in the direction of Jerusalem, and that never changed. So what happened is that the Zionist enterprise begun in such large measure with a thinly veiled, if at all, hostility to tradition, created a schism in the Jewish world. So if you look at this critically, it's not really hard to see this. For instance, the Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, might be one of the only national anthems that doesn't have mention of God, just as a small example, okay? So a lot of very observant Jews, what you might call ultra-Orthodox Jews, did not buy into the Zionist enterprise, okay? Now, flash forward all these years later, where you have millions of Jews living in Israel. So you have different postures towards the state, okay? You have a very minuscule, but very, very raucous group of people who actually go as far as partnering with the PLO and with the president of Iran and God knows who else to fight against Israel, okay? that is an anevma. That's inexcusable. I don't have anything but only really bad things to say about that. Clearly, that's vile. Okay. Then you have communities where even mention of Israel, the state of Israel, is considered kind of verboten. So that would be like, let's say the Satmar community. Okay. Now in Chabad, it's very much about understanding that pragmatically, there are millions of Jews who live in the Holy Land of Israel, that the land is a gift from God, that it's a gift to be living in this era where we can live freely on the land, that we must support the government, that we must fight in the Israeli Defense Forces, that we must be part of that society, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the reason that the Rebbetzin from Nepal was asked not to take part is because that ceremony is intrinsically a Zionist ceremony in which it pays homage to the state of Israel as opposed to the land of Israel. And so it's kind of a very ceremonial, it's really more a ceremonial item than an act of substance. Do you see what I'm saying? So like every Chabad person, wherever they might live, would give their hand and their foot and their head for the land of Israel, which is one and the same right now with state of Israel. So it's not a matter of practical allegiance, of loyalty, of putting ourselves on the line, okay? But there is this kind of policy or principle, and that's what you saw at play. And that's why, ironically, I don't think her husband would have ever even thought of taking that position.
But the Chabad celebrates Yom HaAtzmaut, which is the Zionist enterprise.
So actually, Chabad is not going to go on a campaign against Yom HaAtzmaut, but it's not a celebration that Chabad would kind of initiate or put paramount on our agenda. So if you look at, what Chabad is doing, the Jewish holidays, of course. Now, Yom HaAtzmaut is there's also another factor here, and that is that today there's so much anti-Semitism that's braided in with anti-Zionism. So obviously we're going to support, if a community is going to have a Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, but most often Chabad will have a booth at that community celebration. But again, but theologically or philosophically, that's not going to be the centerpiece of our programmatic priorities. I hope that's helped you in some way.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, in terms of my here, so first I just want to move it so you could see.
Okay. So, okay.
Okay, because I want to retain my cred so Avi could retain his creds.
Okay.
It's not fair to Avi. Actually, Chana, you just reminded me of a true story. Years ago, we were just minding our own business, serving Shabbat dinner to probably at that time 100, 120 students in the room. And this couple walks in with their child, and clearly they were looking around at the university. They had not made reservations. We didn't know they were coming. They came in, we gave them seats. We were, I think, already kind of serving the soup, but I remember bringing them fish, making sure they had challah and salads and so on and so forth. And no matter what I did, I was just getting these really hostile signals for his family. And then we served the dinner, the main course, and then we served dessert. And then we did the ritual grace after meals. And then the family came over to my husband, completely ignored me, came over in a huff and said, I just want you to know that we're really close with Rabbi Moshe Kotlarsky, and we're going to let him know what's going on here. So at this point, I had it. So I said, that's interesting, because we're pretty close to Moshe Kotlarsky ourselves. And what are you going to let him know? So again, they totally ignored me and said to my husband, we're going to let him know that you say you're running a Chabad and your wife doesn't cover her here. That was the first time I actually moved my wig up and down in public to prove that I was wearing a wig. And, I was really quite relieved to know that we have quality control and people are going from Chabados to Chabados to make sure we're as observant as we're supposed to be. But I never forgot that, it was pretty interesting. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Hannah, because I think that a lot of people believe that the reason a married woman covers her head is to somehow look less attractive, less pretty, or whatever. So therefore, your question of how could you wear a wig if it actually looks quite decent is a question that comes up all the time. But actually, according to Jewish law, a married woman covers her hair, and what she covers it with is up to her. So she wants to cover with a potato sack, a lampshade, a wig, a scarf, a hat. All of these are available options. Actually, when I'm not doing a Zoom and looking at, a couple of friends, I actually prefer to wear a hat, which is much more comfortable than my wig. But when I'm out and about, I most certainly prefer wearing a wig because it just looks more natural and I feel like I look better. And there is no imperative for me to look anything but as good as I can look. So everybody wants to look as good as they can. Now the question is, okay, so why does a married woman have to cover her hair? So as I mentioned earlier, modesty is a really important aspect of Jewish observance, both for men and women. And there are laws of modesty for both. And what's interesting is that this law of modesty of the married woman covering her hair, that just kicks in with marriage, which is different than all the other laws of modesty, for instance, covering your knees, covering your elbows, covering your chest, and so on and so forth. And so the best or the closest explanation for this that we have in actual sources is that this is correlated with marriage because that is when, at least ideally in Jewish law, a woman would come into sexual experience, would become aware of her sexual power and prowess, and that necessitates another kind of level of modesty, a reminder of the power of our bodies and how they should be used properly always. And that really explains why a married woman has to cover her hair, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
You're more than welcome. Yes,
I have a question.
you've been very patient.
A couple of things. One is the fact that you mentioned that men wore tefillin all the time.
Mhm.
And was that required? Or when the change was made, I mean, when you say that we're going by Torah, are we going by Torah that we're interpreting it at a later date? Or how did that suddenly, okay, we're not going to do this anymore?
Okay, you ask a good question. So let me explain. As I said, it is important for a man to have two signs. Okay, and there are a number of things in the Torah that are called signs of the covenant between a person and God. One of those is circumcision. That's indelible. That's kind of all the time, right? And then becomes the question of tefillin. So it's very important to have that second sign, but it's also very important that that mitzvah be performed properly. And when it became very apparent that most people could not perform the mitzvah properly if it meant keeping the tefillin on all day, that's when it was scaled back to just a certain point in the day.
So it was a new interpretation.
It wasn't a new interpretation because we didn't have a biblical imperative or a rabbinic imperative to wear it all day.
Okay.
That was considered the best way to do it. But then it became clear that actually that wasn't sustainable for most people. Do you follow what I'm saying? I want to make very, very clear, very certain that you understand. Nowhere in the Bible does it say one must wear tefillin all day.
Yeah, now another question is,
If you'll allow, before you go on with the second question, I want to kind of help, perhaps this will be helpful, give you another parallel, okay? In biblical law, polygamy, or more correctly, polygamy is not prohibited, okay? It's not an imperative, it's not encouraged as a value, but it's permitted, okay? But it then became apparent that this was problematic on at least two grounds. One was that women did not feel that the biblical imperative for their husbands to pleasure them sexually was being fulfilled properly. And second, it made it easier for a Jewish man to kind of drop a woman without giving her a proper divorce. And that's when a rabbinic edict was put into place that prohibits polygamy. or polygamy. So that's another, there's a parallel there if you're catching what I'm saying. Okay, so there are biblical imperatives, and then the law has to bolster that being kept in the best way.
Okay. Another question was, I know a number of women who from the Orthodox movement, not necessarily Chabad, that were told by their parents. A high school classmate of mine mentioned that when she wanted to go to college, her father refused her right to go to college. Everything, she said, from her subway fare on up, she had to use in New York in order to continue her education. Her family's attitude was, you get married, you raise a family.
I think that there were people who held that attitude, and there are those who still hold that attitude. But for a woman to get an advanced degree, an advanced level of education, is not per se contrary to Jewish law. The issue more is, might this in any way compromise her values in terms of a secular college not always being the most hospitable place for an observant Jew to grow in that respect. So that might be one fear. One fear might be that some of the teachings are run contrary to the teachings of the Torah, and so on and so forth. Today, certainly in places like New York and LA and Toronto, where you have these, vast Jewish observant communities, you have colleges, basically networks, which facilitate Jewish observance and still get a really high level of education. So for instance, you have Turo, you have Landers, you have a whole bunch of choices. Certainly if you live in New York, where you can be completely observant, there'll be no issue of conflict between classes and holidays, for instance. And in some of these places, the men and women study in different tracks, in different classrooms, and so on and so forth. So it very much facilitates an observant person getting a higher education, or the highest level of education, and still doing so in an environment that bolsters their primary values. So my guess is that it wasn't so much about the higher education as it was a fear on the part of the parents that this would signal an exit from their way of life.
Okay. One other question. If a man is supposed to procreate, correct? That's a requirement. And he gets married, and the woman doesn't have that obligation. How does that marriage work out?
Okay. So that's an excellent question on a number of levels. Number one, as I mentioned, there was a time where Jewish men might have more than one wife. In that case, there might be a wife with whom he had children, and a woman who decided she wanted to be married, but she didn't want to have children. In this day and age, when that is no longer possible, that's no longer a possibility, when a man and woman get married, if they're operating according to Jewish law, it's understood that they become partners in this commandment together, in this mitzvah. And in fact, if when they're dating, a woman turns around and says to the guy she's dating, I have no intention of having children, then strictly by law, he would not be able to marry her. Now, it's a completely different thing if you get married and then you simply can't have children. That's on God. That's nobody's fault. But if when they're dating, she says, I'm really not interested in having kids, then by Jewish law, he actually would not be permitted to marry her. And I would hope that people would date intelligently. It's funny because all the time people ask me, how do Orthodox people get married if they're not allowed to have sex before they get married? How do they know if they're sexually compatible? And that's a fair question. But my question is, the way people date very, very often, and they don't talk about important issues, how do they know they're compatible? There are other issues in a marriage besides sexual compatibility, and all things being equal, and even putting into the equation sexual dysfunction, which is a real thing. But still, for the most part, people they'll figure it out. It'll be okay. But if there's disparity and there's incompatibility in their values, I don't really see how a marriage can sustain that very long. So definitely how you see yourself in terms of the future and wanting to set up a family and having children is a really important thing to discuss from the get-go.
Well, we're not planning on having any more kids.
Ah, that's a shame.
You have a couple more chat questions.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to let you go in 9 minutes because that'll be, an hour and a half, and I'm going to hockey you a Chainik. Did Avi make everyone laugh in class? Although I taught at Binghamton University for many years, but Avi was never my student in the classroom.
I generally behaved, right? Yeah.
But always a pleasure. It was always a pleasure. If it's unnecessary for women to perform these mitzvahs, then what does it mean if a woman does do them? Would a woman be lesser for not performing them? If it is the same either way, doesn't it render them meaningless? Excellent question, Scarlett. Very, very thoughtful. All right. What does it mean if a woman does do them? It means that she's passionate about her Judaism. And although, strictly speaking, she could be excused, she doesn't want to be excused. So I think everybody here can understand what I'm saying when I say there are things we have to do, and there are things we don't have to do, but we want to do them. We take pleasure in doing them, and we might even fight to do them. Okay, so in this current state in which we find ourselves, I have 3 boys at home who would otherwise be away at yeshiva, but right now they're here. And the other day, I just happened to have a few minutes, and I was on the phone anyway, and I folded the laundry of one of them, and I put it on his bed. And then the next day he said to me, "Ma, you didn't have to do that." And I said, "Yeah, I know I didn't have to do that, but I had a few minutes, and I figured I would do that. I have the opportunity to fold your laundry. I'm happy to do this for you." So what does it mean when a woman does a mitzvah that she's not obligated to? That she's engaged, that she values her relationship with God, that she wants to have the opportunity to bless over the 4 kinds, or eat in the sukkah, or count the omer, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, truth to be told, it actually does say in Jewish law that the person who's commanded to do a mitzvah and does it gets a greater reward than the person who's not commanded and does it, which at first glance might seem counterintuitive, right? Because you didn't command me to do this and I'm doing it anyway. I should get extra brownie points. But interestingly enough, as soon as someone is commanded to do something, there's a little voice in us that says, "I don't want to, make me." But for the woman, she doesn't have that commandment. So it kind of becomes easier, like, "Oh, I want to do it. I feel like doing it. It's floats my boat." So to the questioner, to Scarlett, who's saying, is it the same either way? No, it's not the same either way, because you see, for the woman, if she does it, she gets a mitzvah and it's wonderful. But if she doesn't, again, she has not trespassed the law. For a man who's obligated, again, this is not a suggestion. This is a serious obligation. You've got to do this, and that makes it very, very different. Would a woman be lesser for not performing them? I wouldn't. Look, this is a larger discussion. How do you see commandments? Is it something that's like onerous and it's like, "Oh my God, what can I do to get out of this?" Or do we see commandments? And when I say we, men or women, do we see commandments as a way in towards strengthening and fostering our relationship with God? So it's not a matter of, is she lesser? Really, the question is, has she lost an opportunity? And I would say, if she can do the mitzvah and she doesn't, yeah, she's lost an opportunity. Oh, sorry. There was a question that asked, what does it mean to take the 4? So I'm sorry, I apologize. There's a mitzvah on the holiday of Sukkot. Sukkot is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. And there's a mitzvah on Sukkot. This is the biblical mitzvah to take 4 types of vegetation. See that? He's ordained. Look what he can do. So many tricks. So these are the 4 kinds. There's a lulav, that's the biblical word. That's the palm branch. You have the citron, the etrog on the right. You have the hadassim, that's the myrtle. And then on the left side, you have the aravot. Those are willow branches. And those are the 4 types that Jews are biblically commanded to take on Sukkot. Thanks, Levi. All right.
I think that was the last question.
Okay, great.
Any other last questions before that? And while you're formulating your question, if you do have one, just to share, tomorrow's presentation is by Howard Cabot, a local attorney in town who many of you may know. He is currently the board chair of the Federation, and he is speaking about fighting injustice, the war crimes trial proceeding against the Guantanamo detainee As many of you may know, he defended 20 years ago a terrorist that is currently still incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay Prison, at Gitmo as it's currently known. And he'll be speaking about that, why he did it, why he thinks it's important, and balancing every person's right to a fair trial. And that will be tomorrow's presentation. Again, I just want to thank my mother-in-law who gave again of her time today and her wisdom. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Levi. Always my pleasure. And hey,